Board work is year-round. Case in point, planning for the next proxy season starts when the current annual meeting ends. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. We share perspectives from leading corporate directors and explore what makes boards effective, including how they can help companies prepare for the future. In this episode, Anne Sheehan, a board member at Victoria's Secret & Company and Janus Henderson Group, talks with NACD advisor Susan Paley. Together, they discuss why companies hold annual shareholder meetings. They also dive into a typical annual meeting agenda, the board's role in reviewing proxy statements, and what a successful meeting outcome looks like.
Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Anne Sheehan, welcome. We're so glad that you're joining us today. A lot of business people who have dealt with boards of directors have heard the phrase annual meeting. For those in the audience who aren't super familiar, can you help us understand what is an annual meeting designed to do and why do boards even have them?
Thanks, Susan, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast with you. So the annual meeting, or as sometimes it's called the annual shareholder meeting, is designed really to allow shareholders, the investors in the company, to exercise their ownership rights over the business. Companies hold them, one, because they're required by corporate law to have an annual meeting where their shareholders have to vote on certain mandated activities or agenda items, but also to vote on some other advisory items on the agenda of the annual meetings. So that is really why they hold them. So they vote on certain matters like the election of directors, the compensation program, the ratification of the auditor, if there are any equity compensation plans or stock plans that the company needs to extend or to provide for, if there's any M&A transactions can be on an annual meeting. Sometimes they're at what are called special meetings. And then also any charter amendments to the corporate charter. Companies need to get approval from their shareholders at annual meetings for those changes. So there are some specifically required activities that companies need to ask their shareholders to opine on, and that is done traditionally at an annual meeting.
So annual meetings are doing a heavy lift. I mean, there's a lot that gets jammed into that. So let's unpack a little bit of what that looks like. First of all, with all the important information that's exchanged and actions that are taken, does an annual meeting need to be held in person?
No, there's been a big evolution in annual meetings. Back before COVID and even before that, in the late teens, 2016, 2017, 2018, with the advent of technology, many companies were experimenting with going to have virtual annual meetings. But prior to that, say in the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, annual meetings were held in person where some shareholders would show up at the annual meetings to vote. But because, and we'll get into that, most shareholders vote by proxy, they don't need to be present at the annual meeting. And with the advent of COVID, all companies had to quickly pivot to go to virtual meetings that we're all accustomed to. Some have gone back to in-person, but the convenience for many more shareholders to participate in an annual meeting has come about as a result of the virtual shareholder meetings. I can tell you as a longtime shareholder advocate and investor when I worked at CalSTRS, we were concerned about how virtual meetings would operate. Would they disenfranchise shareholders from participating in the meeting? But in fact, virtual meetings have enabled more shareholders to participate, to ask questions, to act as if they were there in person, but do it in a virtual sense.
Yeah, one of the maybe hidden blessings. So you used the word proxy a moment ago, and I know that'll be part of our conversation going forward, but I want to bring our attention to the annual meetings in terms of the cadence and the timing. We know they're once a year, and we often think about them happening in the second quarter, sort of April, May, maybe sometimes June, which I think is commonly referred to as proxy season. So why do they typically time them in the spring like that? And how long do boards spend preparing for that big meeting?
Well, the annual meetings are traditionally held in the springtime because the fiscal year closes December 31st for many, if not most companies, or one of the boards I'm on, January 31st, because it's a retail company. And obviously the holiday season is important to the retail industry. But it really is linked to the closure of the fiscal year end so that the company can prepare the financial statements, have them reviewed, reconcile all the accounts, have the auditor come in and audit the financial statements because the shareholders want to know that they have audited financials that they can review in preparation for the annual meeting. Since most companies have a fiscal year end at the end of the calendar year, it takes 3 or 4 months for them to go through all of that information, get that material prepared so that the shareholders can vote in either April, May, sometimes early June. There are some companies that have a fiscal year close June 30th instead of December 31st. So their meetings are held in the fall, but the same type of cadence, 2 or 3 months after the closing of the books. The auditor can opine on the financials and get ready for the meeting. So it is traditional that proxy season is in the springtime. April or May is the busiest time for those investors who are voting proxies and voting a lot of proxies. April, May, and June is a very busy time.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a major proxy season and like a mini proxy season.
There is a major proxy season in the springtime, and then in the fall, some of the tech companies like Microsoft used to have their meetings in the fall, but there are some companies that have fall meetings. It's rare. Most of them are in the springtime, but there are some that have almost off proxy season meetings.
So a moment ago, you explained the origins of that spring season coming from the fiscal end of year. So finances were driving that timing. There's, of course, a lot more beyond finances that's involved in the discussions during an annual meeting. So who influences what does make it to the agenda for an annual meeting?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are certain required activities that the company is required for the shareholders to vote on. The election of the directors is one of the most important things. Hopefully that is an annual election. Some companies have what are called classified boards where only a number of directors are voted on in any year. They have, say, 2 or 3 classes of directors. But for the most part, most of the large companies have annual election of directors. And then since Dodd-Frank, since the Financial Reform Act that passed Congress, the companies are required to put up what's called a say on pay vote, which is a vote by the shareholders of the executive compensation program of the company. Now, those are the things that are required. As I mentioned before, also charter amendments. If there is a change that the company wants to make to the charter, if they want to do an equity compensation plan amendment, those are required to be voted on. But on a traditional basis, it is the election of the directors as well as the say on pay. Now, some of the other things that are voted on at a meeting that aren't required but have come into practice is the ratification of the auditor. And that's the auditor. So the audit committee goes through and explains why they hired this auditor, who the audit partner is, what are the fees that they pay. So they inform the voters, the shareholders, about the auditor and the work that they're doing for them. And they ask the shareholders to ratify that auditor, that they're doing a good job. Now, the only time there's a problem with the auditor is if maybe the company had a restatement or a large problem with their financials. That can be troubling to the shareholders. And then the other thing that can be voted on at an annual meeting is shareholder proposals, which are advisory in nature, but a shareholder who owns a certain percentage of the stock under securities laws, does have the ability to offer up what's called a precatory proposal, meaning it's advisory, but it's instructive to the board of directors on an issue that is important to shareholders. And so if they are properly presented, if they qualify in terms of the number of shares that they hold, and they've held the shares for the time period that the company requires, they can offer up a shareholder proposal. And if it is certified, then the company puts those shareholder proposals on the ballot. So the shareholders then also vote on those proposals. But traditionally, as I said, it's the election of directors, the say on pay, the compensation vote, the ratification of the auditor. Those are the things that must be voted on an annual basis. And then depending on if there are shareholder proposals, if there's any charter changes, if there's any equity comp plans, if there's mergers, those also can be voted on at annual meetings.
So you've given us an excellent list of what might be touched on, or in cases has to be touched on. What's a successful outcome of an annual meeting, and what role does the board play in that happening?
Well, the board obviously has a keen interest in the outcome of any annual meeting. One, because they are elected or not reelected to the board, depending on how the shareholders feel about them. But really, a successful outcome is approval with a high percentage of the directors, approval of the compensation plan, and ratification of the auditor. Those are successful meetings if your votes are up in the 90%, I would say, out of 100%. Oftentimes, there's always something in a company's compensation program that some shareholders may not like, which may force a no vote. You rarely get 100%. There's always someone who's a bit of a contrarian, either on a director or on a comp plan, or they may not like the auditing company that you're using. A successful meeting is up in the high 90s. If you get a vote, say, on the compensation program below 70, that sends a signal to the board that you and the company that you have a serious problem with your compensation plan, and you need to get out and talk to your shareholders about what their concerns are. But for directors, we spend the whole year, along with our corporate staff and the corporate secretary, preparing for the annual meetings and for the issuance of the proxy, which we'll talk about, to get ready for the annual meetings as to what goes in and how we're going to communicate with our shareholders and what are the matters that we want to bring before them at the annual meeting.
So before we unpack the proxy statement that you just mentioned, I'm curious if some of our listeners are serving on boards or looking at serving on boards of private companies or nonprofits. What of the description you've just offered is strictly for public companies versus private? How does that break down?
Well, what I am talking about today is public companies, publicly traded companies that are listed on the exchange, not so much for the private companies. They do not have to have annual shareholder meetings. They can choose to. They do not have any of the requirements that a publicly traded company has that I mentioned in the activities that would be on an annual meeting agenda.
Great. That's good clarity. So let's circle back to proxy statement that you mentioned a minute ago. First of all, why do organizations have them? What are they?
A proxy really is a mechanism for shareholders to be able to vote their shareholder interest at a company. You're not going to have however many thousands of shareholders attend the meeting in person. So a proxy enables them to give instructions to an authorized person to vote their shares according to the instructions that they provide in the proxy statement. So I like all the directors. I want to vote yes on all the directors. Oh, I don't like the chair of the comp committee. So I want to vote yes for all the directors except for the chair of the comp committee. So they give instructions to someone else. It's a legally binding document that they can vote their shares, their proxy, in accordance with their instructions. And as I said, most of the shareholders are not going to go in person to the meeting. So this is a mechanism for them to participate as owners of the company, as shareholders in the company, to exercise their ownership rights and to vote and send instructions to someone to vote in accordance with their instruction. And the proxy is a very large document that it's both a compliance document under securities laws. And what I've seen over the years, the proxy has become a vital communication document for a company to communicate with their shareholders. It used to be you only had those minimum things that I mentioned, the election of directors and some of these other activities that were in the proxy and that had to be voted on. But because the proxy is sent to all the shareholders, companies are using it as a communications tool to get their shareholders, one, to vote, but also to share with them what is going on with the strategy of the company, what's the direction of the company, how they're handling compensation, what's their governance structure, what are the backgrounds of the directors, and gives them deep details about the skills and qualifications of the director, what the auditor's activities were in terms of overseeing that, and then also what each of the committees is doing. Traditionally, companies have compensation committee, nominating governance committee, and an audit committee. The compensation committees have now really become the human capital and compensation committee of most publicly traded companies, or the talent committee. They have different names for different things on the compensation. But what the proxy enables a company to do is to communicate with their shareholders what the activities of each of those committees are carrying out on their behalf over the years, how maybe they've made change to governance guidelines, how they brought somebody new onto the board that the shareholders will be voting on, why they did, if they made a change in an auditor, if they made a change in an audit partner, if they made a change in their compensation plan in terms of more performance stock units or restricted stock units that they may give to executives. All of the details of all of these things are inside the proxy these days. And so that proxy statement that is sent to shareholders is extremely important. One of the other developments we've seen recently with proxy statements is a letter to shareholders from the CEO and the chair, or sometimes two letters, one from the chair of the board explaining to the shareholders what the priorities of the board was that year, what they're working on their behalf, and then one from the CEO talking about the business of the business, the strategy, how the company is performing, what some of their new activities may be. So it really is a helpful tool for the shareholders to understand what is going on at the company, and then the letter from the chair, what is going on at the board level and how the board is carrying out their responsibilities on behalf of the shareholders. Because really the vote for the directors is to enable them to act in the best interest of the shareholders. So the shareholders elect the directors every year through an annual election process to enable them to act on their behalf, overseeing management as the shareholders of that company.
So again, I mean, the proxy statement is doing an incredibly large job. There is so much that's packed into there, and you walked us through that really beautifully. And I'm curious, this hefty document, who's responsible for compiling and preparing that? What role does the board play? Are they reviewing every page of it? Are they spot checking? What's important for them to review of that, and why?
Yeah, traditionally, the corporate secretary's office, which is usually inside the general counsel's office, at times the corporate secretary and the general counsel can be the same person or they can be different. But really, the corporate secretariat is traditionally the office inside a company that is responsible for preparing the proxy. They're the ones that deal with securities laws, what needs to be in, how we have to put those in. But to your point, the board plays a crucial role in making sure they know what's in the proxy. The directors go through every page of the proxy numerous times and make sure we want to change this, we want to tweak this, we want to move this up, we want to highlight this more. So it's extremely important for the board to be involved in the preparation of the proxy. The preparation of the proxy is a year-round event. The minute an annual meeting is over, we begin to think about, okay, what are we going to do next year? How are we going to put it together? There again, the corporate secretariat's office does a scan of what people are doing out there in the marketplace to change their proxy. Are there some best practices that each of us can learn from in terms of more that can be done? An example is you're seeing much more growth in skills matrix about how directors are qualified to be sitting on a board. So what are the skills that the company needs? And then what are the skills and experience of the board members? And then there's a narrative about each of them in terms of that. So there have been a few developments over the past few years about growing the proxy and with the idea of trying to give shareholders more insight and information about how the board and the company operate. Having been on the other side as the director of corporate governance at CalSTRS, when I was there, we voted like 7,000 proxies. So it was hard to get the insight as to how that company and how that board is acting on our behalf. So the proxy really is a key document for the company to be able to shed light on the operations of the company, the operations of the board, how they are acting on our behalf. So it's a critical tool for any company. And it's especially important for the board of directors to know what's in the proxy and to have an active role in preparing and reviewing the proxy.
The mind reels around how many labor hours are invested in a given calendar year into that proxy statement across all those individuals.
Well, proxies can be a couple hundred pages. So you have a lot of information that has to be checked and rechecked and put in the right format and presented to the shareholders so that they really understand what is happening. Many times results of the votes at the annual meetings can be the shareholders sending a signal that they don't understand something, or they may vote no on a compensation plan because maybe you haven't explained it properly. So that mechanism by which they send a signal to the company and to the board of directors, those no votes, or if you have lower than 90% on some of these, that then helps the company go out and the board of directors engage with the shareholders throughout the year to understand, why did they vote no? What could we do different? Did we not explain it properly? Did they just have opposition to what it was? But it's a signaling mechanism for our owners, our shareholders, to tell us how they feel about how we're doing.
Such a great example that maybe the comp plan wasn't explained sufficiently. In your many years of experience on both sides of the table, is there anything else that you think a board can do to ensure the effectiveness of the proxy statement?
Well, I think the board really needs to go through in excruciating detail. One, the information about them. Are we properly explaining what the background of, say, Anne Sheehan as a director is? What is the experience that I bring to the board? But also to read it as kind of an objective third-party person, not wearing only your board hat, but okay, if I were a shareholder at one of our big investment firms, how would I read this proxy? Is it clear for me to understand what they're trying to signal to me and communicate about how things are going? So it's very helpful, I think, for the board to pay attention to the detail and to read it kind of as a dispassionate, objective observer.
Remind me of the timeline. If I'm going to an annual meeting, let's say April 30th, when would I see my proxy statement?
You would have the proxy statement approximately 6 weeks earlier or a month earlier. You have what's called a record date that you establish when you're going to have the annual meeting. So the record date is shareholders who are owners of the shares as of that record date are the ones eligible to vote. So that's usually a few months in advance. And then the proxy goes out and the voting can open up approximately 3 to 4 weeks out. So you get the proxy in time to read it, to go through it, to understand what is going on in terms of that, and you're not rushed in order to vote your proxy.
So I'm a shareholder. I receive my proxy. I roll up sleeves, buckle down, and read all 200 pages of it or whatever it may be. And I show up at the annual meeting. How do I engage during that annual meeting? What's that experience like for me?
So shareholders are able to engage at an annual meeting. Now, when annual meetings were in person, and some of them were large, especially after the financial crisis, you would have hundreds of people show up at annual meetings in order to voice their support or opposition, depending on what went on. Walmart used to have their annual meeting in the stadium at the University of Arkansas, and they would fill it with people. So it has been a big shift in terms of the changes in the annual meeting going to virtual. But with the current process of most companies having virtual, some have gone back, but for the most part, they're virtual. In the proxy, it explains to shareholders if they want to speak at an annual meeting, ask a question, how they are to participate. Do they want to just send in the question in writing? Do they want us to open up the microphone in the Teams or the Zoom or whatever the platform is that we're using, so that they can talk to us. In the in-person, almost every company had, at the end of the meeting, after you concluded the business of the meeting and you closed the polls after the votes, the shareholders had the ability to stand up and to ask a question or to make a comment. Now, they had to sign in with the corporate secretary and say, I want my 2 minutes or my 3 minutes at the end. So they did that. So since we've moved to virtual, we had to really replicate that process online. So it really is, the shareholders have to register, a process for them to register to ask a question or to make a statement, and the company will allow them to do that at the shareholder meeting. It's extremely important for shareholders to be able to participate in the annual meeting if they want to. But the one thing I'll say, Susan, is that many companies have gone to engagement off proxy season. So it's not only the annual meeting where they have the ability to talk to the directors or interact with the companies. Obviously, companies do quarterly earnings calls for the sell side and the buy side, and they talk to them. But some of the larger investors, the board will get out and talk to some of those investors in the off proxy season. So while the annual meeting can be a mechanism, the more impactful engagements with shareholders are traditionally done off proxy season. Because remember, for many of these big shareholders, such as BlackRock or State Street, they're voting hundreds of meetings in a very short period of time. So it's hard to have those engagements during proxy season. But actions at the annual meeting and the results of the annual meeting can very much drive what the agenda is for the engagement in the off proxy season. For an example, if they voted against the say on pay, then we set up meetings. What was your concern? Why did you vote against it? Many investors vote against both the say on pay, the compensation plan, as well as the comp committee members because they want to send a signal we're unhappy. If they don't like something the governance committee did, or we haven't done refreshment enough of our board members, they will, for example, vote against the chair of the nominating and governance committee. If we had a big cyber incident and they don't feel the audit committee, many audit committees are responsible for cybersecurity oversight, they may vote against the chair of the audit committee as a way to signal that they want to engage and talk about what the concerns are with whatever the risk was. It could be a cyber breach, it could be a financial risk, whatever it is. But it's a mechanism for the shareholders to tell us, we have concerns about this and we want to talk more about it.
And I'm so excited about this conversation because these are some of the most basic blocks and issues of governing an organization. And you're really giving us a masterclass that I think can't easily be found elsewhere, because I think once you're on a board, the ship's already left the station, or the train has left the stations. These are good basics. So another reason I'm excited about talking to you is that you really bring a wealth of experience from both sides on a board of directors, on multiple boards, and also you've had years of experience at CalSTRS, as you mentioned earlier. So my question is, how has that experience, let's look primarily at the CalSTRS experience, informed your serving as a board member during proxy season? And even to the point of what lessons have you accumulated from years past that would shift your approach in the coming year or at all in your work?
Well, making that shift from being on the investor side, voting the proxies, to then being inside the boardroom, it really was, it was a smooth transition, but truly I understood now what it meant to be inside the boardroom and what we did to communicate to our shareholders. I came in with that lens of, we are all shareholders, the directors are shareholders, management, and then our investors. So how can we make sure we are properly communicating with the investors as to what is going on inside the company? So having voted all those proxies, met with so many board members while I was at CalSTRS, it shed new light for me on how we really operationalize some of the things that I used to see as an outsider looking in. Now I'm the insider looking out to those people and trying to make sure that they have the information that we want them to have so they can truly understand what is happening at the company, that they have faith in the board that is carrying out their desires and representing the shareholders. Because at the end of the day, the board of directors is there to represent the shareholders. That is the job, to carry out their fiduciary duty of oversight of management. So the perspective of both the investor, a large investor, and now a director, also a share owner, really was helpful for me to make that transition in terms of that. But it really, what I would say most specifically, Susan, is it reminded me every single day that I'm there on behalf of all of our investors, representing their interests in the company. And that's got to be first and foremost in the mind of the directors as they carry out their duties.
What an absolutely perfect way to wrap up our conversation. Anne Sheehan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. This was terrific.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.